The world was not as we know it. Vast white plains stretched endlessly in every direction, a frozen silence broken only by the wind's haunting whisper. The air itself was heavy with ice, biting through fur and skin, searing lungs with every breath. Snow fell like ash from a dying sky, and beneath its weight, the bones of forests and animals lay buried, locked in the timeless grip of winter. This was the world that early humans inherited, a land sculpted by glaciers and ruled by cold, where survival was not a right, but a fragile bargain struck each day against extinction. The Ice Age was more than a period in history. It was a relentless test of endurance. Temperatures plummeted to unimaginable lows. Rivers turned to glass, and mountains wept with frozen tears. Herds of mammoths trudged slowly across the tundra, their footprints soon erased by the storm. Wolves, larger than any known today, prowled the shadows. Even the sun, pale and distant, offered no warmth, only the illusion of day. In this world, warmth was a treasure rarer than gold, and every spark of fire was a victory over the universe itself. For the cavemen who roamed these lands, existence was a battle of wits as much as of strength. They lived in scattered bands, clinging to the edges of habitable valleys or the mouths of caves that could shield them from the wind's fury. The cold could kill faster than hunger. Frostbite claimed fingers, ears, and lives. The snow hid dangers beneath its innocent sheen, treacherous ice, sudden crevasses, and predators lying in wait. To survive meant not only to fight the cold, but to understand it, to read its patterns, anticipate its moods, and adapt with the instincts of both animal and mind. The landscape itself was alive, though in a way that seemed almost cruel. Every sound carried far: the distant cracking of ice, the eerie howl of wind over the plains, or the echoing cry of a lone hunter separated from his group. The earth trembled occasionally under the slow movement of glaciers, grinding stone into dust over centuries. Nights were long, unending stretches of darkness where the stars burned with cold clarity. In that vast blackness, early humans huddled together, pressed close to one another in the faint glow of their fire, as though the flame were the heart of existence itself. And yet, even here, in the coldest reaches of prehistory, life persisted. The human body, fragile yet ingenious, began to evolve. Layers of fur and hide became armor against the cold. The mind grew sharper, driven by necessity. Hands that once clutched crude stones began to shape tools, carve bones, and strike flint to spark the first fires. The very cold that sought to destroy them became their teacher, forcing them to innovate or die. In that struggle, humanity discovered the seed of its greatest strength, adaptation. There was beauty amid the brutality. Sunlight, when it broke through the clouds, scattered across the frozen landscape like shards of crystal. The world glowed blue and gold, silent and eternal. Steam rose from the nostrils of great beasts as they moved across the horizon. For those early humans, this was not merely a landscape. It was their entire universe, their test, their home, and their enemy. Every sunrise was uncertain. Every night a triumph if they survived until morning. This was the dawn of human resilience. Before tools, before civilization, before language as we know it, there was the will to endure. The will to keep moving through the snow, to protect the flame, to find warmth in each other's presence. It was here, in this frozen wilderness, that humanity was truly born, not in comfort, but in the struggle against a world determined to erase it. And as the wind howled over the ancient ice, carrying with it the ghostly echo of footsteps long vanished, it whispered the same story it has told for tens of thousands of years: that life, no matter how small, will always fight the cold. At first, there was only darkness and the endless cold. The Ice Age night could stretch for weeks, swallowing the world in a silence so complete it felt alive. In that darkness, the first humans trembled, not just from frost but from fear. Every shadow seemed to move, Every gust of wind sounded like a beast's breath. And then, one day, from the friction of stone against stone or the spark of a lightning strike, came a flicker, fragile, trembling, alive. Fire, the first miracle born of human hands. That flicker was not just light, it was salvation. It hissed against the snow, fed on dry grass, and rose, painting the cave walls in gold. For the first time, the cold retreated. The people gathered around it, wide-eyed and silent, watching the flames dance as though some spirit had descended from the sky. Fingers that had been numb began to feel again. Breath came easier. The fire crackled and popped, a living creature that seemed to speak in a language older than words. Around it, fear loosened its grip. Learning to create fire was a revolution in survival. The earliest humans used stones rich with iron, pyrite or flint, striking them until a spark leapt into waiting tinder. Dried moss, animal fur, or shredded bark caught the ember. They shielded it from the wind, cupping it like a newborn. In that moment, humanity learned its first great ritual, the protection of flame. Fire was not a tool. It was a companion, a fragile friend that could die if neglected. Entire clans took turns keeping it alive, carrying embers in hollowed bones or wrapped in bark as they moved across frozen plains. But the Ice Age was cruel to fire. Wind could snuff it out in seconds, snow could drown it, and damp wood would refuse to burn. So they learned. They learned to build stone circles to shelter the flame. They learned to dig shallow pits, using bone and hide as barriers. They learned to burn fat, the oil from animals, when wood was scarce. With every discovery, they grew wiser, bending the rules of nature one spark at a time. The cold was still vast, still merciless, but now there was a small, stubborn light that defied it. Fire changed everything. It was warmth for the body, yes, but also food for the mind. Around it, people began to gather, not just to survive, but to share. Stories were born in that orange glow, tales of spirits, beasts, and ancestors. Shadows on cave walls became living art, painted by firelight and imagination. The light revealed faces, tired, scarred, but alive. It revealed the eyes of children, shining with wonder as they watched sparks climb into the darkness. For the first time, night was no longer the enemy. Yet, fire was dangerous too. It could consume as easily as it could comfort. The same flame that cooked their meat could burn their shelters or scar their hands. To master fire meant to respect it, to treat it as both a gift and a threat. That duality became a cornerstone of human understanding. Everything that sustains life also holds the power to destroy it. In learning to control fire, humans learned to balance between creation and ruin, warmth and death. There were rituals born from this understanding. Some tribes offered a piece of their hunt to the flames, whispering thanks to unseen forces. Others sang as they built fires, believing the sound helped it grow strong. The fire pit became sacred ground, a circle of safety where predators dared not come. Beyond its glow, the world remained wild and hostile, but within its reach, people felt something new, belonging. The flame was not just heat, it was identity. As snowstorms raged outside, the fire became the center of life. Around it, skins dried, tools hardened, and wounds healed. Hunters planned their next journeys, and children learned the stories of their ancestors. In that warmth, humanity began to think, to dream, to imagine futures beyond survival. Fire was the first teacher, showing them that nature could be shaped, that they could create instead of just endure. When dawn finally broke after long nights, the fire still smoldered, a glowing heart within the ashes. The people fed it, nurtured it, and carried its coals forward, step by step, into the frozen unknown. With every ember they protected, they carried their future, a future where light would always follow them, no matter how cold the world became. The first fires in the snow did more than save them from freezing. They awakened something far deeper. The knowledge that even in the darkest, most merciless winter, warmth could be made by human hands. From that moment on, humanity would never again face the night unarmed. The cold did not rest. Even when fires burned and the hunt was successful, the wind found its way through every crack, every fold of hide, every weakness in the human world. The open plains offered no mercy, only endless snow and shadows that stretched for miles. It became clear that fire alone was not enough. Humanity needed walls, roofs, and refuge, a way to carve warmth out of the frozen wilderness. Thus began the quiet, ingenious age of shelter building, a story of bone, ice, and will. The first shelters were humble. Caves were nature's ready-made refuge, carved by time and rivers before the ice came. Inside their stone bellies, the wind could not reach. Here, flickers of firelight painted the walls with orange life, while outside, snow buried the world. But caves were scarce and often dangerous, already home to bears, lions, or wolves. So the cavemen adapted. They began to shape their own homes, crafting structures that mirrored the resilience of the earth itself. Where caves ended, creativity began. Archaeologists have uncovered circular remains of dwellings built from mammoth bones, massive ribs and skulls forming frames, covered with hides and packed with snow to seal in heat. Each bone was both structure and memory, a relic of a hunt that had kept them alive. Imagine the sight, a family huddled beneath an arch of ivory, listening to the wind roar outside while fire crackled softly within. The warmth would rise, mingling with the smell of smoke and fat. Outside, blizzards raged unseen. Inside, humanity endured. Snow itself became a building material. It was no longer an enemy, but an ally. Pressed and packed, it formed walls that held warmth surprisingly well. Some shelters resembled primitive igloos, shaped not for comfort, but for survival. Cavemen learned that the air trapped within snow acted as insulation, a paradox of nature where cold protected against colder. Within those pale domes, a faint glow of fire reflected off the white walls, making the interior shimmer like gold. It was as if the ice itself had become their armor. Every shelter told a story of adaptation. Some were simple windbreaks made of branches and hides. Others were intricate nests built into the earth. Entrances were narrow to trap heat, and sleeping spaces were layered with furs. The design was always the same: minimize loss, maximize life. A single mistake, a tear in the hide, a draft through the wall, could mean death before morning. Building was no longer just a craft. It was an act of survival, a test of wisdom passed down through generations. But shelters were more than physical protection. They became sanctuaries for the spirit. Within their walls, the chaos of the frozen world paused. Children laughed softly, fires hummed, and stories were shared in whispers. The shelter became the first home, not just a place to rest, but a place to belong. It was where bonds were forged, love was kindled, and memory took root. In the glow of the hearth, humanity found the idea of inside, a word that meant safety, warmth, and life. Outside, snow piled higher. Predators prowled in the night, following the scent of smoke. Sometimes, storms would bury entire shelters, forcing the inhabitants to dig their way out. Sometimes the fire would die, and panic would spread like frost. But always they rebuilt. Always they learned. A stronger frame, a thicker wall, a smarter design. The harshness of winter refined their intelligence as surely as it shaped their hands. Inside these shelters, evolution quickened. Fingers became more skillful, minds more observant. They studied how wind curved through valleys, how snow drifted, how bones could be balanced. Their homes were born not from abundance, but from observation, a deep understanding of nature's materials and moods. In learning to build against the cold, humans began to control their world, not just survive within it. And in that control lay the first glimmer of civilization. The walls of bone and ice were more than barriers. They were beginnings. Beginnings of architecture, community, and imagination. The cold had driven them to the edge of extinction. But from that edge, they built homes, proof that even in a land made of death and frost, life could create something lasting. When the storm quieted and dawn returned, The shelters stood half buried in snow, silent monuments to human endurance. Smoke curled from their tops, rising like prayers into the pale sky. Inside, beneath layers of fur, the people slept, breathing slow, steady alive. In a world that tried endlessly to freeze them, they had found a way to stay warm. The shelters of bone and ice were more than homes. They were declarations of defiance. The frozen plains stretched endlessly, shimmering beneath the pale light of a dying sun. To the cavemen, this world was both a promise and a threat. A vast, silent expanse filled with life that could feed them and dangers that could end them. Food was not a convenience. It was a war fought daily against hunger, cold, and the cunning of nature itself. Every meal began as a risk, every hunt as a gamble with death. And yet, without the hunt, there was no survival. The white wilderness demanded courage, precision, and a heart that refused to yield. Hunting during the Ice Age was not a simple pursuit. It was a ritual of endurance. Prehistoric hunters faced the most formidable creatures that ever walked the earth: mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, bison, reindeer, and cave bears. These beasts were massive, powerful, and perfectly adapted to the cold. A single mistake could mean the difference between triumph and tragedy. With nothing but sharpened spears, stone-tipped weapons, and teamwork, early humans learned to face giants that towered over them. They hunted not for glory, but because the alternative was starvation. The white wilderness offered no mercy. The wind erased tracks, hid sounds, and numbed fingers until they could barely grasp a weapon. Hunters learned to move slowly, silently, blending into the snow itself. They studied the behavior of prey, the way herds gathered before a storm, how the snow crunched differently under heavy hooves, and how the wind carried scent. Knowledge became their greatest weapon. Every movement was measured, every breath mattered. To chase blindly was to die. To observe was to live. In this world, deception was as vital as strength. Hunters sometimes walked backward in the snow to confuse predators or rival tribes, making it appear as though they were retreating when they were stalking. They smeared themselves with animal fat to mask their scent, used the terrain to set ambushes, and drove prey toward hidden traps. Intelligence replaced brute force. The caveman's mind became as sharp as a spear. Nature had forged predators out of humans, not by giving them claws or fangs, but by teaching them to think. When the hunt began, it was chaos and precision intertwined. The air filled with the sound of shouts, the stampede of hooves, and the thunder of spears hitting flesh. Blood steamed against the snow, red and violent against the white world. There was no cruelty in it, only necessity. To take a life was to give life to the tribe. As the beast fell, the hunters stood in silent reverence, exhausted, trembling, but victorious. Their breath came out in clouds, their eyes reflecting both triumph and sorrow. They knew the cost of survival. After the kill came the ritual of gratitude. The meat would be divided carefully, the bones used for tools, the fat stored for fire. Nothing was wasted. To waste was to offend the spirits of the hunt, to break the balance that sustained them. Around the carcass, stories would be told, memories shared of hunts gone right and wrong. The fallen animal was not just food. It was a teacher, a reminder that every victory carried the shadow of death. The women and children waited by the fires, watching the horizon. They knew the rhythm of the hunt, how long it took, what silence meant, and when to fear. When the hunters finally returned, dragging meat through the snow, the entire camp erupted in life. Fires blazed higher. The smell of roasted flesh filled the air. Laughter, brief but fierce, returned to the cold. For a few days, hunger would rest, and warmth would find its way into every heart. Yet even in moments of success, the wilderness loomed. The next hunt was never far away. Blizzards could erase everything in an hour: tracks, prey, and hope. Sometimes hunters did not return. Their spears would be found months later, frozen into the ice, silent memorials to bravery. Still, others would rise to take their place. The instinct to provide was stronger than fear. Over generations, these hunts shaped not just the body, but the soul of humanity. Muscles grew stronger, minds keener, spirits more resilient. Cooperation became sacred, a bond stronger than blood. Each hunt was a lesson in unity, showing that alone a man could freeze or starve, but together a tribe could defy nature itself. As the snow settled and night fell once more, the hunters sat by the fire, sharpening their weapons for tomorrow. Outside, the wind howled through the bones of the earth, whispering its eternal challenge. The white wilderness would never stop testing them, and they would never stop answering. In every heartbeat, in every strike of flint and step in the snow, humanity proved one truth. Even in a world made of ice, the will to hunt, to live, burned hotter than any fire. In the Ice Age wilderness, where snow erased the world anew each morning, every mark left behind was a message, and every message could mean life or death. The land was a living scroll of signs, the faint depression of a hoof, the brush of a branch, the half-print of a claw. To the untrained eye, it was chaos. But to the cavemen, these tracks spoke a language older than words, a code of survival written in ice and shadow. They learned to read the land as others would later read books, tracing the stories left by every creature that walked before them. Footprints in the snow told everything: who had passed, how long ago, how fast they were moving, and whether they were prey or predator. A broken twig could signal danger. A drop of blood on the frost could lead to food. The cold itself preserved every detail, turning the ground into a perfect memory of movement. Hunters became interpreters of this frozen script. They followed trails for miles, learning to sense direction by the shape of snow drifts, to smell distance in the air. But they also knew that their own tracks could betray them. To leave a mark was to reveal one's presence. And in a world full of predators, both beast and man, invisibility was the highest form of wisdom. That is why some learned to walk backward. It was a trick born of desperation and brilliance. When danger followed too closely, the cavemen would reverse their steps, making it seem as though they had gone the other way. Sometimes they brushed away their prints with branches. Other times they walked along the paths of animals to disguise their scent. The snow was their enemy, but also their canvas, and deception was their art. To confuse a predator was to buy another hour of life. To mislead a rival tribe was to protect one's family. The act of walking backward became a kind of dance between hunter and hunted. Imagine a small group moving silently through the pale landscape, retracing their own steps in perfect rhythm, the snow creaking softly beneath their furs. Behind them, the prints turned and twisted, an illusion meant to fool the sharpest eyes. The cold wind howled across the plains, but they kept their pace, their hearts steady. In this fragile choreography, they transformed survival into strategy. Every print erased, every path hidden, was a declaration that they understood the land better than anything that stalked it. This mastery of tracks was not only practical, it was spiritual. The cavemen believed the snow remembered. To leave too many footprints was to reveal one's soul to the spirits of the wilderness. They feared that the land itself could betray them, that unseen watchers, ancestors, gods, or beasts followed the lines they left behind. And so, hiding one's tracks became an act of humility, a way of blending back into the world rather than standing apart from it. They sought not domination over nature, but coexistence within its silence. Tracking also shaped their relationships with animals. Hunters watched how wolves pursued prey, how deer zigzagged through snow, how foxes circled back to confuse scent. From these lessons, they borrowed tactics, patience, stealth, deception. In the mirrored intelligence of predator and prey, humans found their place in the chain. The line between animal instinct and human reason began to blur. They were no longer just participants in the wilderness. They were learning to master its language. The art of tracking was taught not through words, but through watching. Elders would lead the young across the ice, pointing silently at faint signs. a shift in texture, a hidden depression, a mark half buried by wind. The lesson was not about what to see, but how to see. It was training the eyes to notice what others ignored, to hear what the snow whispered. In this way, tracking became the first science, the earliest form of reading, and perhaps even the seed of storytelling. Each track a beginning, each hunt a narrative that ended in firelight and shared memory. Sometimes, though, the hunters became the hunted. Rival clans, desperate for food or territory, would follow footprints just as they followed the herds. Entire lives could depend on who read the tracks more accurately. A single mistake, a misinterpreted path, a false assumption, could lead one group directly into the ambush of another. The snow was honest, but also merciless. It showed truth to those who could read it and death to those who could not. As the centuries passed, this language of tracks and shadows became ingrained in human instinct. Even today, a distant echo of it remains. The urge to cover our trail, to move unseen, to understand the ground beneath our feet. The cavemen, in their frozen world, had discovered something profound, that survival was not only about strength or fire or tools, but about perception, about knowing how to vanish when the world was watching. And so, as the snow fell endlessly, covering and uncovering the stories of those who walked before, the cavemen continued their quiet dialogue with the land. Their footprints, fleeting yet eternal, told of fear and cunning, of pursuit and escape. Each print was a heartbeat, each path a memory. And though time would one day erase them all, the lesson remained that in the cold silence of nature, even the smallest trace can speak volumes about life's determination to endure. When the sun slipped behind the mountains and the long cold swallowed the plains, darkness became a living thing. It crept from the forests, crawled across the snow, and pressed against the walls of every shelter. For the cavemen, night was not simply the absence of light. It was a world ruled by watchers they could not see. Eyes glimmered in the shadows. The low growl of beasts echoed through the frozen air, and even the wind carried voices that seemed almost human. In this uncertain realm, fire became their guardian, the only force that could hold the night at bay. The first spark was a miracle. When dry bark caught flame beneath a shower of struck stone, it was as if the world itself had been split open. Fire gave warmth, light, and courage, but it also demanded reverence. The cavemen treated it like a living spirit, a creature that needed feeding, tending, and respect. They built their fires carefully, shielding them from the wind with stones and bone. Around that fragile glow, they gathered to tell stories, patch furs, and guard against the encroaching dark. The flicker of flames painted their faces in gold and shadow, turning each figure into something half human, half myth. Fire was safety, but it was also a signal. Its light could be seen for miles, by allies, but also by predators. Wolves learned to linger just beyond its reach, their eyes gleaming like distant stars. Sometimes the men would throw burning sticks into the dark to keep them back, watching the glowing eyes scatter and reform. There was a grim understanding between hunter and beast. The fire was a border neither dared to cross. And yet, even surrounded by warmth, fear lingered. The night held secrets too vast to name, and the cavemen knew that some eyes could not be frightened away. Those who kept the night watch bore the heaviest burden. As others slept, wrapped in furs and dream, one or two would sit by the fire, staring into the endless dark. They listened for the snap of twigs, the whisper of movement, the shift of snow. The fire hissed and cracked, and sometimes they imagined shapes moving just beyond the circle of light, figures that were neither animal nor man. The watchers learned that silence was deceptive. The world could attack without warning. They understood that the fire's glow was both protection and trap. The brighter it burned, the less their eyes could see beyond it. To stare too long into the flames was to go blind to the world behind them. Some nights, the fire refused to catch. Damp wood, frozen kindling, or a sudden gust could plunge their world into darkness. Panic would spread like a contagion, for without fire, they were exposed. In those moments, the night became absolute, a suffocating ocean of cold and fear. Hands shook as stones struck together, desperate to summon a spark before something unseen crept closer. When at last the flame returned, a sigh would ripple through the camp. Relief so deep it bordered on worship. Fire was no longer just warmth. It was the heartbeat of existence. The elders told stories to explain the night watchers, unseen spirits that moved through the darkness, neither friend nor foe, who judged those who slept too soundly. Some believed the watchers were ancestors, guarding the living through the long winters. Others whispered they were lost hunters, doomed to wander until someone remembered their name by firelight. Either way, the cavemen learned never to turn their backs to the night. Even as they slept, one ear always listened, one eye half open. The fire changed everything about their nights. It extended their days, allowed them to dream, to plan, to create. Around it, they learned rhythm. The crackle of flames became a kind of drumbeat that marked time in a world without clocks. Shadows cast by the flames danced against cave walls, giving birth to the first art. When they painted hunts or beasts on stone, they were not just decorating. They were capturing the movement of firelight, freezing it in pigment. The fire became both muse and mirror, showing them the power to create as well as destroy. But there was always a price. Fire consumed, and wood was scarce. To feed the flames, they had to wander farther each day, stripping forests bare, returning with arms full of frozen branches. They learned that too much flame could attract others, rival tribes drawn to the glow like moths. The fire gave life, but it also drew death. Yet they could never abandon it. In its warmth, they saw hope. In its ashes, memory. As the ice age deepened, fire became the heart of every gathering, the symbol of survival itself. It turned strangers into companions, silence into song, darkness into meaning. Even as snow buried the earth and the wind tore through the trees, the fire stood, small, flickering, defiant. It was humanity's first rebellion against extinction, a fragile sun born from stone and will. And so, through countless nights, the cavemen kept their watch. The flames rose, the shadows danced, and the night watchers lingered beyond the circle of light, patient, eternal, waiting for the fire to falter. But it never did. As long as the cavemen breathed, they would guard the flame, because within it burned not just warmth or light, but the very proof that they were still alive. In the heart of the Ice Age, survival began with shelter. The biting winds could slice through even the thickest fur, and snowstorms could bury a man in minutes. For the cavemen, building a refuge was not just an act of comfort. It was an act of defiance against a world determined to erase them. Each night spent beneath the open sky was a gamble with death, and each wall raised against the storm was a small victory for the living. They became masters of improvisation, sculptors of the land itself, bending nature's harshness into their protection. The earliest shelters were simple, hollows beneath cliffs, shallow caves warmed by the fire's breath. But as the cold deepened, these nomads learned to create their own havens. They gathered bones from mammoths long fallen and used them as frameworks, covering the structures with hides stitched from the remains of hunted beasts. Every rib, every tusk became part of their architecture. The massive bones curved together like the ribs of a sleeping giant, forming domes that could resist the brutal winds. These shelters were not just homes. They were monuments to endurance, shaped by hands that refused to surrender. Inside these shelters, warmth became an art. Stones were heated in the fire and buried beneath firs to radiate heat through the night. Entrances were angled away from the wind, sealed with thick hides that rustled like the breath of some sleeping creature. Smoke from their fires curled upward, blackening the ceiling. But even that soot became part of their world, a protective layer that sealed cracks and trapped heat. The smell of burned wood, animal fat, and damp fur filled the air. It was not pleasant, but it meant life. Every breath of that smoky air was proof that the storm outside had not yet claimed them. The placement of these shelters was strategic. Cavemen chose locations with natural cover, near cliffs and forest clearings, or close to frozen rivers where water could be accessed when the ice was broken. Some built partial underground dwellings, using earth itself as insulation. By digging down and layering branches and hides above, they created womb-like chambers that trapped warmth and silence. In those spaces, the howl of the wind became a distant memory. It was in these burrows that the first true sense of home was born. Not just shelter from the cold, but a place of belonging, of family, of safety. As their knowledge grew, the shelters evolved. Groups that followed the mammoth herds learned to dismantle and carry their dwellings. Early versions of portable homes. The hides could be rolled and tied, the bones reused. Every piece was precious, nothing wasted. When the tribe moved, they carried their world with them, rebuilding it wherever the land allowed. Each campfire, each circle of bones, was a brief heartbeat in a long migration through frost and fear. These temporary homes, though fragile, gave a sense of rhythm to their wandering lives. Inside, life followed quiet rituals. Children played near the warmest spots, tracing patterns in the dirt. Women stitched hides by flickering firelight, turning sinew into thread. Hunters returned with frost clinging to their beards, shaking the snow from their cloaks before stepping inside. The shelter filled with steam as the cold melted from their bodies. Here, laughter sometimes returned, soft and cautious, like an animal peeking from its den. Even in the hardest winters, moments of peace existed, cradled within the walls they had built by hand. But the shelters were never invincible. A single misjudgment, a weak bone in the structure, a gust too strong, could tear everything apart. There were nights when the wind screamed through the cracks and the walls trembled. The cavemen would huddle together, arms wrapped around children, praying the storm would pass. When morning came, some shelters stood half-buried, others gone entirely. Yet they rebuilt. They always rebuilt. The earth was both their enemy and their ally. From its bones and stones, they forged endurance itself. Even their dead were not left to the mercy of the cold. Sometimes, when the snow was too deep to dig graves, the fallen were placed near the entrance of the shelters, covered with furs, as if still part of the living circle. Their presence reminded those inside of what waited outside. The silence, the frost, the endless dark. It gave the survivors reason to fortify, to keep building, to keep living. Every shelter stood as both tomb and cradle, where death lingered outside, but life persisted within. In time, these shelters shaped their minds. The cavemen began to think in terms of inside and outside, of protection and exposure. Home became not just a place, but an idea, the first flicker of civilization's foundation. The act of building gave them control over chaos, a small piece of mastery in a wild, indifferent world. The same hands that once tore meat from bone now crafted walls, stitched seams, and molded earth. In the rhythmic work of building, they discovered purpose beyond hunger or fear. And so, the shelter became more than structure. It became symbol. It represented the first human boundary between nature and self. Outside lay the cold, the predators, the uncertainty of existence. Inside lay warmth, light, memory, and love. Every storm that raged above their domes only reinforced the power of what they had built. These were not mere dwellings. They were the wombs of humanity's survival. Through ages of snow and silence, those crude homes endured. Long after the fires had died and bones had turned to dust, the traces remained, circles of mammoth ivory buried in frozen soil, the faint shadows of walls once alive with firelight. Each remnant tells the same story, that in the face of endless winter, mankind built warmth with will alone. The shelter builders did not conquer the cold. They learned to live within it, to carve out small pockets of life where none should have survived. And because of that, the human story continued. When the cold ruled the land, hunger became a constant companion. Food was never guaranteed. Every meal was a battle between patience and peril. In the endless white plains of the Ice Age, the cavemen became hunters not out of choice, but necessity. Their lives depended on understanding the movements of beasts far stronger and swifter than themselves. Each hunt was a gamble with death. One misstep, and the hunter became the hunted. Yet, through intelligence, cooperation, and sheer will, they transformed from prey into predators, mastering a world that seemed built to destroy them. The frozen wilderness offered little mercy. Herds of mammoths, woolly rhinos, reindeer, and giant bison roamed the plains, their breath steaming in the frigid air. To the cavemen, these creatures were both life and danger, towering mountains of meat and bone. A single mammoth could feed an entire tribe for weeks, but to bring one down required strategy and courage beyond measure. Spears of sharpened stone were their only tools, flung with desperate precision against beasts whose tusks could shatter a man in an instant. Success was not measured in strength, but in cunning. Hunting in winter was an art of silence and shadows. The cavemen learned to read the land, the broken snow revealing a herd's path, the faint warmth of droppings hinting at how long ago they passed. They tracked footprints for miles, often in blizzards that erased the trail as they followed it. Every sound was amplified in the cold. The crunch of snow could give them away, so they moved like ghosts, breathing shallowly, their furs blending with the frost. When the wind shifted, they froze, waiting until it carried their scent away from their prey. It was patience that kept them alive, not speed. When the moment came, the attack was swift and chaotic. The hunters would drive the beasts toward hidden traps or cliffs, where they could corner and overwhelm them. Spears rained like hail, each strike aimed for vital points taught through generations of experience. The ground shook with the panic of stampeding hooves, the air thick with roars and shouts. Sometimes the hunters triumphed. Other times they fell beneath the very creatures they pursued. The snow drank both bloods equally. Hunter and hunted became one. After a successful hunt, the tone shifted from violence to reverence. The tribe approached the fallen beast with awe, as though standing before a god. They touched its body, whispered thanks, and offered small tokens, stones, feathers, or ash, to honor the life taken. They believed the spirit of the animal watched them, judging how its death was treated. Waste was forbidden. Every part of the creature had a purpose: flesh for food, bones for tools, sinew for thread, hide for warmth, fat for fire. The act of butchering was ritual, each cut made with respect. Through this, the cavemen formed a bond with nature not of domination, but of exchange, life feeding life. The harshest hunts came not from necessity, but from desperation. When the herds moved too far south and hunger gnawed like a disease, the hunters turned to riskier prey. Packs of wolves and saber-toothed cats competed with them for the same food, and sometimes for the same territory. There were stories told by the fireside of great battles in the snow. Man against beast, fought not just with weapons, but with will. The hunters learned to understand these predators, watching how wolves coordinated, how they read the wind and moved together. In time, this understanding became partnership. Some wolves began to follow the hunters, scavenging from their kills. Slowly, fear turned into recognition, the first steps of a bond that would change both species forever. In the stillness of the tundra, hunting was also a mental trial. The cold numbed fingers and dulled thought. Exhaustion blurred the line between reality and hallucination. Hunters spoke of hearing voices in the wind, the cries of ancestors or the spirits of animals guiding them. Whether real or imagined, these whispers became part of their instinct. They learned to listen to the land itself, sensing when to strike, when to wait, when to retreat. Survival was not brute force. It was intuition sharpened by centuries of struggle. When they returned to their shelters, burdened with the weight of their success, the tribe greeted them as heroes. Fires blazed high, songs rose into the night, and stories of the hunt were told and retold. Each tale became a lesson for the young: how to move unseen, how to read the snow, how to respect the prey. The children learned that hunting was not about killing, it was about balance. The hunters were the guardians of that balance, ensuring that life continued through the endless winter. Yet, beneath the triumph, there was always sorrow. Each hunt took lives, not just the animals, but sometimes their own. The tribe carried scars, both visible and unseen. They mourned their dead as they honored their kills, burying hunters beside the bones of the beasts they had fallen to. Over time, these shared graves became sacred grounds, symbols of the eternal exchange between man and nature. In those places, snow covered all equally. The hunter, the hunted, the witness. Through it all, the cavemen learned the deepest truth of their existence. To live was to take, but also to give. Every hunt was a conversation with the earth, one written in blood, snow, and breath. They walked the frozen plains not as conquerors, but as part of the same story told by the wind and the beasts. The hunters of frozen shadows did not defeat the wild. They became part of its rhythm. And in that fragile harmony, humanity found its first true strength. While the hunters ventured into the frozen plains, risking their lives for the kill, those who stayed behind waged a quieter but equally crucial battle against hunger. In a world where food could vanish overnight beneath snow and ice, gathering became a discipline of patience and wisdom. The cavemen understood that survival depended not only on strength, but on foresight, the ability to find sustenance hidden beneath a land that seemed barren. In this balance between hunter and gatherer, the rhythm of life was sustained, and humanity's earliest sense of cooperation was born. The gatherers were the silent keepers of survival. They scoured frozen valleys and riverbanks, searching for anything edible, roots clinging stubbornly to the earth, dried berries preserved by frost, mushrooms frozen mid-growth. Every find, no matter how small, carried weight. A handful of seeds could mean the difference between life and starvation. The cold turned the world into a puzzle, and only those with sharp eyes and steady memory could piece together its secrets. They learned which plants resisted frost, which stones concealed edible moss, which trees bled sap that could be boiled into nourishment. In their hands, the land's smallest offerings became sacred. Season after season, their knowledge grew. The gatherers began to map the world in their minds, not through drawings or words, but through memory. They remembered where the hardy tubers grew, where winter berries clustered on the south-facing slopes, where streams thawed earliest in spring. This mental map was passed from elder to child, spoken in stories that blended myth with instruction. Where the rocks sing in the wind, one might say, the red roots sleep beneath. These oral maps became a lifeline, preserving knowledge across generations. In the harsh cycles of the Ice Age, wisdom was wealth, and the gatherers were its guardians. They also learned the art of preservation. In the brief weeks of warmth, when the world burst into fragile life, the gatherers worked relentlessly. They dried berries over fires, smoked fish caught from thawing rivers, and stored marrow-rich bones in frozen ground. They discovered that certain animal fats could preserve meat, that cold caves acted as natural larders. Through trial and error, they learned how to stretch abundance into scarcity. It was the beginning of planning, a concept that transformed mere survival into strategy. Inside the shelters, the gatherers' work continued. Women and elders often ground seeds between stones, creating coarse flour that could be mixed with animal fat to make dense, energy-rich cakes. Dried herbs were stored not only for food, but for medicine. Leaves that soothed wounds, roots that eased fever, bark that numbed pain. Their world was their pharmacy, and each discovery was marked by careful observation and story. When a child fell ill and recovered, it was remembered. When someone died after eating a strange plant, it became a warning whispered in the dark. Through loss and persistence, knowledge took shape. Gathering was also a social act. While the hunters disappeared for days into the wilderness, the gatherers worked in small groups. Mothers, children, and elders moving together, watching the land. They learned to read the sky, to sense when snow would fall or when the earth would loosen. Their conversations became filled with subtle codes, the tone of voice, the gesture of a hand, that carried more meaning than words. This quiet coordination laid the foundation for communication itself. Language began not around the fire or in battle, but among those walking the frozen fields, naming the world together. Yet, the work was dangerous. Beneath the snow hid cracks, sinkholes, and predators stalking the same scarce prey. A gatherer bending for roots might find the gleam of eyes behind the frost. Some never returned, their tracks swallowed by storms. The others learned to move with caution, to never wander too far alone. They carried sharpened sticks and stones, and sometimes small charms carved from bone, symbols of protection and luck. Even in silence, they walked with faith. In time, the gatherers became storytellers. At night, while the hunters spoke of their battles, the gatherers told quieter tales, of plants that slept through winter, of trees that whispered to each other, of spirits that guided hands toward hidden food. These stories turned the act of survival into mythology. Children learned not only how to find food, but how to see the world as alive, connected, and speaking in signs. In their understanding, nature was not an enemy. It was a living partner, unpredictable but full of meaning. Their role in the tribe was profound. Without the gatherers, the hunters' victories would be fleeting. Without the hunters, the gatherers' stores would run dry. Together, they represented the two halves of human endurance: strength and foresight, action and patience. This balance created the first true form of cooperation, the seed of society. Around their combined efforts, families grew, knowledge deepened, and survival evolved into something greater: community. As the winters dragged on and the earth remained locked in ice, the gatherers' contribution became even more vital. When the animals vanished south, their preserved stores became the tribe's only hope. In those moments, every dried berry, every carefully hidden root became a symbol of life's persistence. The cavemen learned that even in the coldest, most lifeless landscapes, nourishment existed, if one only knew where to look. Through the gatherers, humanity developed its patience, its memory, and its empathy. Their work taught observation, restraint, and gratitude, traits that would shape the future mind of humankind. They were the ones who looked beyond the immediate, who trusted that effort today would bring survival tomorrow. The hunters may have claimed glory, but it was the gatherers who quietly ensured that the fire never went out, that the tribe could endure the long, merciless winter. And in their careful hands, civilization took its first breath, born from the frozen soil, nourished by the wisdom of those who listened to the land. In the frozen silence of the Ice Age, survival demanded unity. No single man, woman, or child could endure the cold alone. The cavemen learned that strength was not born from isolation, but from connection, from the invisible thread that bound them together around the fire. These bonds, forged through hunger, fear, and hope, became the foundation of early human society. Family was not merely blood. It was everyone who shared warmth, who watched the fire through the night, who stood together when the snow howled. From these small clusters of kin and kindred, humanity's first sense of belonging took root. Their shelters were not just physical protection. They were the cradle of community. Inside, life unfolded in rhythm. The hunters returning with frost on their beards, the gatherers sorting roots and dried berries, the elders murmuring stories that carried the memory of generations. Around the fire, everyone had a role. The young fetched wood, the women mended hides, the men shaped new spears, and the elders guided them all. Every task was a piece of survival's puzzle, and each person's hands contributed to the tribe's continued existence. Through cooperation, they discovered that the whole was far greater than its parts. The bonds within the tribe were not only practical, they were emotional, spiritual, and sacred. In a world where death was always close, affection became a silent rebellion. Parents held their children tightly, sharing their warmth through nights when the wind clawed at the walls. Laughter echoed even in hunger, for to laugh was to prove that fear had not conquered them. When a child spoke their first word or took their first step on frozen ground, the tribe celebrated as though life itself had triumphed. Each new birth was a spark against the endless dark, a promise that their kind would not fade. Elders were revered as keepers of memory. They carried the stories of hunts, the wisdom of seasons, the lessons written in blood and frost. Their words shaped the tribe's understanding of the world. Tales of ancestors who walked with fire spirits, of beasts that tested mankind's courage, of the balance between taking and giving. Around the firelight, these stories stitched generations together. When the young listened, they were not just hearing the past. They were inheriting the knowledge that would guide their own survival. Through storytelling, time itself became a shared thread, connecting the living to the dead. Conflict still arose, as they always would. Hunger sharpened tempers, scarcity bred envy, and fear tested loyalty. But even in anger, they understood that separation meant death. To survive the cold, they needed one another. Disputes were settled by the elders or by ritual, offerings of food, shared hunts, or nights of silence. Forgiveness was not a luxury. It was a necessity. The tribe's unity was its armor, and every quarrel mended through understanding strengthened that shield. In learning to live together, they took their first steps toward civilization. Among them, love began to take shape, not just instinct or pairing for survival, but something deeper. The bond between mates was marked by shared labor, mutual protection, and trust. When one hunted, the other prepared warmth and food. When sickness struck, the healthy cared for the weak, even when resources were scarce. This devotion transcended survival. It was the earliest form of compassion. The firelight reflected in their eyes as they watched one another, silently vowing to endure together. In those moments, humanity's heart began to beat. Children were the tribe's future, and their laughter filled the shelters like a fragile melody against the wind. They learned by watching, mimicking the motions of throwing a spear or tracing the patterns of animal tracks in the snow. The tribe taught them not only how to survive, but why. Each gesture, each story, instilled in them the sacred balance between fear and courage, hunger and gratitude, life and death. They were raised to respect the fire, to listen to the elders, and to honor the beasts that fed them. Childhood was short, but its lessons lasted beyond generations. As the seasons turned and years passed, bonds between neighboring tribes sometimes formed. Small groups met at hunting grounds or along rivers, exchanging goods, stones, and stories. These meetings were cautious at first, but necessity bred trust. They traded hides for tools, meat for herbs, knowledge for peace. In these rare gatherings, the spark of a greater human connection appeared, the first sign that cooperation could extend beyond bloodlines. From these encounters, language began to grow richer, ideas spread farther, and the seeds of culture were sown. The fire was always at the center. It was where the tribe ate, where they dreamed, where they mourned their dead. When someone passed away, the flames became their final companion. The tribe would place a burning branch beside the body, believing the spirit would follow the light to the ancestors. They cried softly, not from despair, but from remembrance. For every death was a reminder of how fragile and precious life remained. The fire was not just warmth. It was memory, connection, and love made visible. Through these shared moments, the hunts, the stories, the births, the losses, the cavemen discovered something greater than survival. They discovered meaning. To live together was to carry one another through the cold, to ensure that even in the darkest nights, a spark endured. The bonds of blood and fire were humanity's first civilization, unrecorded but unbroken, passed from hand to hand through the ages. In their unity, they found hope. In their hope, they found the will to keep walking, to keep building, to keep the fire alive. And from those flickering circles of light in a frozen world, all of human society began. For the cavemen, winter was more than a season. It was a trial, a sacred cycle that tested every part of life. In the cold and silence, survival became a ritual, a rhythm woven into daily life. The ways they prepared, hunted, gathered, and sheltered were not only practical but ceremonial. Every action carried meaning, rooted in respect for the forces that shaped their world. In this season of hardship, ritual became a language, a way to confront fear, honor life, and bind the tribe together. Before the first snow fell, the tribe prepared with ceremonies that were part prayer, part strategy. Elders led gatherings where they recited stories of past winters, teaching lessons hidden within myth. These were not merely tales, but instructions disguised as tradition. They spoke of hidden routes, of paths animals followed, of the importance of fire and shelter. Offerings of berries, carved stones, or sharpened tools were made to unseen spirits, the guardians of land and sky. These rites grounded the tribe, giving them purpose as the cold approached. The turning of seasons was marked by feasts, even in scarcity. When the hunters returned with meat, the tribe gathered to share it, ensuring that no one ate alone. These gatherings became acts of unity and gratitude, moments when survival became celebration. Around the fire, food was distributed not by rank, but by need, each portion a symbol of mutual dependence. Songs were sung softly, rhythms carried by deep voices that rose and fell with the crackle of flames. These were songs of endurance, chants meant to weave strength into their bones before the trials ahead. Ritual extended into the hunt itself. Before a dangerous expedition, hunters would perform rites to call courage and precision. They might smear their bodies with ash or animal fat, believing it would carry the protection of the beast they sought. Spears were sharpened in silence, and some tribes painted marks on their arms or faces to honor the hunt. These acts transformed the hunt into more than survival. It became a sacred trial. Success meant sustenance. Failure was a lesson carried forward in ritual and memory. Within the shelter, rituals took quieter forms. Each night, before sleep, the tribe gathered by the fire. Hands were warmed, words were shared, and the day's events were spoken into the smoke. Elders might chant softly, calling blessings upon the hunters and gatherers, thanking the spirits for life preserved. These nightly gatherings were as much about protection as they were about tradition. They turned survival into a shared vow, binding each person to the tribe's continuing story. Some rituals were born of fear. The winter night held dangers that could not be named, and rites were created to ward them away. Charms were carved from bone, feathers were tied to sinew, and strange patterns were etched into stone. These objects were not just tokens. They were prayers, physical embodiments of the tribe's hope. The making of these charms became a communal act, a quiet defiance against the vastness of the cold and the silence that followed. Ritual also shaped their relationship with death. When a hunter fell, the tribe gathered not only to mourn, but to honor him. Fires were kept burning through the night, offerings placed beside his body to guide his spirit beyond the frost. The shelter became a place of remembrance, where stories of his bravery were spoken softly, and lessons from his life were taught to the young. Death was not the end, but a transformation, woven into the tribe's endless cycle of survival and memory. Even the smallest acts were infused with ritual. The preparation of hides, the sharing of water, the passing of a tool, all were done with gestures that carried meaning. These acts taught discipline, respect, and connection. They turned the daily grind of survival into a living tradition. Each member of the tribe learned that life in winter was not only about enduring the cold, but about honoring the life that persisted through it. Over time, rituals became the tribe's language of survival. They carried knowledge, taught values, and created cohesion. They made the unpredictable rhythms of the Ice Age bearable by giving them structure. In those cold, flickering nights, ritual became a form of control, a way to impose meaning upon a world where chaos ruled. They were the thread that connected past and present, the unbroken bond between generations. Through these winter rituals, the cavemen learned more than survival techniques. They learned resilience. They learned that endurance was not only the act of withstanding storms, but the act of creating meaning in the face of them. Ritual turned survival into culture, hunger into respect, and fear into courage. In the long nights of the Ice Age, ritual was the ember that kept humanity's spirit alive, and that ember would burn for thousands of years, becoming the heart of every civilization to follow. In the deep stillness of the Ice Age, the wind became a storyteller. Across frozen plains and beneath endless skies, sound carried far. The crack of ice underfoot, the distant roar of a predator, the muffled whispers of the tribe's own voices. For the cavemen, communication was survival. They learned to speak in ways that transcended language, turning sound into signal, story, and warning. In winter's vast silence, voices became their most vital tool, a way to preserve knowledge, share hope, and bind themselves together against the cold. Speech grew from necessity. A warning shouted in time could save a life. A name given to a hidden root could save the tribe from hunger. They developed words not only for the obvious, snow, fire, hunt, but for subtle experiences, the scent of ice after a storm, the sound of snow settling underfoot, the weight of silence before danger. Language became a map of survival, naming not just objects but feelings, dangers, and wisdom. Around the fire, children learned these words in context, absorbing their meaning not through lessons, but through life itself. Storytelling became the heartbeat of the tribe. Before sleep, elders gathered their people to speak of ancestors, of hunts that tested courage, of winters that had shaped their survival. These stories were vivid and practical, a blend of myth and instruction. Legacy also lived in the relationships they nurtured. Bonds between hunters and gatherers, between elders and children, between tribes and their allies, became part of a social inheritance. These connections taught trust, cooperation, and respect, lessons as vital as fire or food. In their unity lay strength, and in their strength lay the ability to endure the harshest winters. This understanding of interconnectedness became a foundation of human culture. The legacy of the Ice Age was also a legacy of adaptation. Cavemen learned to read the signs of the land, to listen to the whispers of the wind, to respect the cycles of life and death. They adapted their hunting methods, their shelters, their rituals to match the changing world. This adaptability became part of who they were, a legacy of resilience written in bones and footprints across frozen landscapes. They learned that survival was not static, but an evolving art shaped by every winter and every choice. Even death became part of their legacy. The way they honored the fallen, with offerings, with stories, with memory, became part of the tribe's heritage. Graves carved in stone or snow became markers of respect, teaching the living to carry forward the lessons of those who came before. In remembering their dead, they preserved not only history, but identity. Legacy was the promise that they would endure, that their people would carry their story forward. As the ice aged and generations passed, the legacy of these cavemen stretched beyond their own survival. It became the foundation of human endurance, the first chapters of culture and civilization. Their lives, written in the language of snow, fire, and story, became the roots of a greater human journey. The legacy in the ice was not a single moment, but a thread woven through time, the first proof that humanity could endure, adapt, and pass its flame onward. In the end, the cavemen of the Ice Age left more than survival behind. They left a blueprint of cooperation, resilience, respect, and memory. That legacy became part of the human story, carried forward through millennia. And in every generation that learned to walk together, share warmth, and honor life, the legacy of those who endured the coldest winters lived on. They spoke of great hunts where fire had turned the tide, of nights when the shelter had failed and the tribe survived by moving as one. They told of spirits that roamed the snow, of animals that taught lessons to those who listened. These narratives passed knowledge forward, embedding survival tactics in memory wrapped in wonder. Beyond practical knowledge, voices carried emotion and tradition. They turned the act of speaking into ritual. Songs rose around the fire, sometimes as quiet chants, other times as powerful calls that echoed into the night. These songs marked moments: the return of a successful hunt, the birth of a child, the mourning of a fallen hunter. Rhythm and repetition turned speech into ceremony, binding the tribe's collective memory to the language of the wind. Through song, they shaped identity and preserved the spirit of their people. Communication was not limited to speech. Gesture, expression, and even silence were part of their language. A pointed look might warn of danger. A hand motion could direct a hunter's path. Silence itself became a code, especially in the stillness of the hunt or the watch by the fire. It was a language of trust, learned in the harshness of winter where one careless sound could mean death. In that silence, they heard the unspoken, the rhythm of the world around them, and the shared heartbeat of the tribe. They also learned to listen deeply to nature. The crack of ice could signal approaching weather. The howl of distant wolves could mean both danger and opportunity. The tribe's survival depended on interpreting these voices of the wild. They believed the land itself spoke, in the creak of frozen wood, in the shifting of snowdrifts, in the whisper of the wind. To understand these sounds was to understand life itself. This listening became a skill passed down through generations, a language older than words. Through voices in the snow, the cavemen built their history. Every spoken story became a record of their trials, victories, and losses. Every song became a thread connecting the past to the present. These oral traditions shaped their culture and anchored their place in the world. In a time without writing, their voices became the vessel of their memory, carrying their survival across seasons and centuries. By sharing knowledge in stories, songs, and silence, they learned that survival was a shared song. It required listening as much as speaking, understanding as much as acting. Their voices in the snow became an unbroken chain linking generations, a living testament to humanity's will to endure. And in those cold, whispering nights, they knew that as long as they spoke, they would never truly be alone. Winter was never still for the cavemen. The ice was not simply a season. It was a shifting world, a living landscape that demanded movement. Food, shelter, safety, all depended on their ability to travel across the frozen plains. Journeys became a necessity, not a choice, and every trek carried the weight of risk and reward. The cavemen learned to move as one, guided by instinct, knowledge, and an unspoken understanding that survival often meant leaving the known for the unknown. Migration was born from necessity. When game moved south or rivers froze beyond reach, entire tribes took to the ice. They traveled in slow, deliberate columns, elders leading, hunters scanning ahead, and children sheltered in the center. Paths were chosen with care, guided by memory, the patterns of stars, and subtle signs in the snow. These routes became lifelines, mapped not in charts, but in story and instinct. Each journey became a test of endurance, a trial where every step mattered. The cold shaped these journeys in unforgiving ways. Blizzards could erase tracks, hide landmarks, and scatter the group. Spring was a season of growth for the tribe itself. Children grew stronger in warmth, learning more each day of the language, tools, and rituals of survival. Elders shared wisdom more freely, knowing their lessons were rooted in years of hardship. Hunters and gatherers planned for the seasons ahead, building stores for the next winter, weaving their survival into a cycle that stretched beyond themselves. In those months of renewal, the tribe strengthened, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. The passage of seasons became a rhythm, and they became attuned to its pulse. The dawn of a new age was marked by change in more than weather. The lessons of survival began to grow into vision. They learned to create tools that endured longer, shelters that could withstand harsher storms, and strategies that expanded their reach. Journeys became more ambitious, exploring new lands and testing new ways to live. They were no longer simply surviving the winter. They were learning to master life within it. The tribe evolved, carrying with them the seeds of culture, technology, and connection that would define humanity for millennia. Spring also brought deeper connection to the land. The cavemen understood that survival was not just about taking what they needed, but sustaining what they depended upon. They tended to sacred spaces, marked by stone or bone, where rituals of renewal took place. Offerings were made to the spirits of the land, thanks given for life preserved. These acts became a living tradition, reinforcing the bond between the people and the world that sustained them. Through gratitude, they forged a deeper respect for the cycles of nature. The tribe's celebrations of a new season were quiet yet profound. Around fires and shelters, and in open clearings, they gathered to honor survival and renewal. Feasts were shared, songs were sung, and dances marked the joy of life returned. These moments were more than relief, they were affirmation. They reaffirmed their strength, their unity, and their ability to endure. Every celebration became a promise to themselves that no matter how fierce the winter, they would survive and stand together to greet the dawn. The dawn of a new age was also a moment of transformation for the tribe's identity. They began to see themselves not only as survivors of winter, but as builders of culture. Their traditions, tools, and stories became part of something larger, a shared heritage that connected them to ancestors and descendants. They became aware that each winter survived was part of a greater journey. This awareness shaped how they lived, how they taught, and how they prepared for what lay ahead. In that fragile light of early spring, the cavemen saw the future. They knew that the lessons learned in ice and shadow would define generations to come. They carried forward the knowledge of fire, of shelter, of unity, of respect for the wild. And with that knowledge, they stepped into a new age, one not only of survival, but of growth, connection, and possibility. The winters they endured had forged them, and the springs they welcomed gave them a legacy. In the dawn of a new age, humanity began to dream beyond survival, towards civilization. Wolves followed silently at the edges of the tribe's path, drawn by the scent of movement. The wind carved deep ridges of snow, making progress exhausting. To survive, they moved with patience and discipline. They learned to pace themselves, to rest in sheltered hollows, to ration what little food they carried. Every journey was a balance between speed and caution, survival and preservation. Travel was also a shared experience of community. Around fires built during stops, they planned the next stage, repaired clothing and tools, and shared stories to keep morale strong. The elders taught lessons during these pauses, pointing to the sky, tracing marks in the snow, explaining the signs of changing weather. The young learned not just the route, but the skills to survive it. These journeys became living classrooms, where survival was taught step by step. Some migrations became epic journeys that shaped the destiny of the tribe. Driven by scarcity or driven by instinct, tribes would follow herds across hundreds of miles, crossing mountains, rivers, and endless plains. These journeys transformed their understanding of the world. New lands became home, new shelters were built, new dangers were faced. Every journey was both an ending and a beginning, a chapter written in frost and determination. Travel forged bonds beyond survival. Shared hardship deepened trust and reliance. The act of moving together through storms and darkness became a test of the tribe's unity. Those who faltered were carried. Those who fell were mourned along the way. Journeys became rites of passage, moments where courage and loyalty were measured. They were also opportunities for innovation, developing lighter shelters, sharper tools, and strategies for finding food in unfamiliar places. The frozen world taught them that movement was survival. The act of journeying became part of their identity. They learned to read the land as a map and the weather as a guide. They spoke of paths with reverence, naming them in stories so they could be remembered. These paths became part of their heritage, a living network of memory stitched into generations. In time, the journeys shaped more than their survival. They shaped their vision of the world. Tribes learned that the land was not fixed, but a living force, constantly shifting and demanding adaptability. Every journey was a lesson in humility, in respecting the vastness of nature. To walk across the frozen world was to understand life as a journey itself, fragile, collective, and defined by perseverance. Through their long, dangerous travels, the cavemen became wanderers and keepers of stories. Every path taken was recorded in memory. Every hardship became a lesson, and every journey became a thread in the tapestry of human survival. They did not simply cross the frozen world. They carried themselves across it, leaving trails of endurance, courage, and the will to continue. In that movement lay the promise of survival, the first sign that humanity could adapt, endure, and journey beyond the limits of the cold. In the endless winter, the world beyond the shelter was both a source of life and a realm of danger. Cavemen lived in constant awareness of the wild, the beasts that roamed under snow, the shifting storms, and the quiet forces of nature that could strike without warning. They became not only hunters and gatherers, but guardians, learning to live in harmony with the world that surrounded them. Survival depended on understanding the balance between taking and respecting, between fear and coexistence. Over time, this balance shaped the way they moved, hunted, and even thought. The wild was not simply a backdrop to their lives, it was a teacher. The cavemen learned to read animal behavior, to sense patterns in migration and movement. They observed how wolves hunted in packs, how mammoths moved through valleys, how birds flew before storms. These lessons were passed down with reverence, not as science, but as tradition. To the tribe, knowledge of the wild was sacred, something earned through years of listening and watching. Those who mastered it became respected leaders, the guardians whose wisdom protected the tribe from unseen dangers. Guardianship meant more than survival, it meant stewardship. The cavemen learned not to take more than they needed. Spring was a season of growth for the tribe itself. Children grew stronger in warmth, learning more each day of the language, tools, and rituals of survival. Elders shared wisdom more freely, knowing their lessons were rooted in years of hardship. Hunters and gatherers planned for the seasons ahead, building stores for the next winter, weaving their survival into a cycle that stretched beyond themselves. In those months of renewal, the tribe strengthened, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. The passage of seasons became a rhythm, and they became attuned to its pulse. The dawn of a new age was marked by change in more than weather. The lessons of survival began to grow into vision. They learned to create tools that endured longer, shelters that could withstand harsher storms, and strategies that expanded their reach. Journeys became more ambitious, exploring new lands and testing new ways to live. They were no longer simply surviving the winter. They were learning to master life within it. The tribe evolved, carrying with them the seeds of culture, technology, and connection that would define humanity for millennia. Spring also brought deeper connection to the land. The cavemen understood that survival was not just about taking what they needed, but sustaining what they depended upon. They tended to sacred spaces, marked by stone or bone, where rituals of renewal took place. Offerings were made to the spirits of the land, thanks given for life preserved. These acts became a living tradition, reinforcing the bond between the people and the world that sustained them. Through gratitude, they forged a deeper respect for the cycles of nature. The tribe's celebrations of a new season were quiet yet profound. Around fires and shelters and in open clearings, they gathered to honor survival and renewal. Feasts were shared, songs were sung, and dances marked the joy of life returned. These moments were more than relief, they were affirmation. They reaffirmed their strength, their unity, and their ability to endure. Every celebration became a promise to themselves that no matter how fierce the winter, they would survive and stand together to greet the dawn. The dawn of a new age was also a moment of transformation for the tribe's identity. They began to see themselves not only as survivors of winter, but as builders of culture. Their traditions, tools, and stories became part of something larger, a shared heritage that connected them to ancestors and descendants. They became aware that each winter survived was part of a greater journey. This awareness shaped how they lived, how they taught, and how they prepared for what lay ahead. In that fragile light of early spring, the cavemen saw the future. They knew that the lessons learned in ice and shadow would define generations to come. They carried forward the knowledge of fire, of shelter, of unity, of respect for the wild. And with that knowledge, they stepped into a new age, one not only of survival, but of growth, connection, and possibility. The winters they endured had forged them, and the springs they welcomed gave them a legacy. In the dawn of a new age, humanity began to dream beyond survival, towards civilization. They hunted with precision, sparing weak or pregnant animals, knowing the herd must endure for their own survival. They gathered only what could be carried or stored, leaving enough for the earth to replenish. This instinct for balance was not born of theory, but of experience. Seasons when greed had stripped the land taught harsh lessons, and the tribe adjusted their ways. From necessity grew respect, and from respect grew a fragile pact with the world around them. Guardians also protected knowledge. They remembered safe paths, hidden sources of food, and the signs of changing weather. They taught younger generations not only how to survive, but how to read the language of the land. These lessons were woven into story, song, and ritual. Around fires, the elders spoke of the animals as kin, of the snow as a living spirit, of the land as a teacher. This reverence shaped their actions, creating a culture where survival was intertwined with respect. The Guardian's role extended to defending the tribe. Rival clans, driven by hunger or competition, sometimes crossed paths. Encounters could erupt in violence, but they could also lead to trade or alliance. Guardians guided their people in these moments, using strategy as much as strength. They knew when to fight, when to withdraw, when to seek peace. This wisdom came not only from instinct, but from generations of trial, teaching that survival was as much about diplomacy as about strength. Their relationship with predators was another form of guardianship. Wolves, saber-toothed cats, and bears were not merely threats. They were part of the world's balance. Cavemen learned to avoid needless conflict, to track without disturbing, and to respect the boundaries of these powerful beings. At times, they followed predators at a distance, understanding their role as guides to prey. This knowledge deepened their bond with the wild, a silent recognition that life depended on cycles of respect and restraint. Guardianship shaped the tribe's survival strategies. It influenced where shelters were built, how hunts were planned, how journeys were undertaken. It became an unspoken code, a set of instincts and traditions that protected both the people and the land they lived in. They passed this knowledge through generations, so that even the youngest could feel the weight of responsibility toward the wild. It was not ownership they claimed, but guardianship, a duty to preserve life in all its forms. Through storms, hunger, and endless nights, the guardians stood at the tribe's edge, watching, listening, and guiding. They were the keepers of balance in a world defined by extremes. In their watchfulness lay the survival of the tribe, and in their respect lay the seed of humanity's future. They did not conquer the wild. They learned to walk with it, carrying both its dangers and its gifts. And in doing so, they became part of the great story of life itself. The winters of the Ice Age were not merely seasons. They were crucibles that shaped the soul of humanity. Every trial endured, every hunt survived, every journey undertaken left traces in the memory of the tribe. These traces became more than survival skills. They became legacy. The cavemen carried forward lessons in courage, patience, and unity, etched into story, ritual, and blood. In the heart of the frozen world, they began to build the first echoes of culture, a legacy written not in stone, but in the living breath of generations. Legacy was carried in memory. Elders became walking libraries, remembering every hunt, every storm, every lesson passed down. They taught that survival was more than an act. It was a story to be told, a heritage to pass on. Around the fire, they spoke of winters so harsh they thought the world would end, and of how the tribe endured through unity. These stories became the tribe's history, binding each generation to the last. The past became their teacher, the present their challenge, and the future their promise. The legacy of winter survival was practical as well as spiritual. Techniques learned over generations, from crafting better shelters to tracking prey in snow, became shared knowledge. These methods were refined over time, becoming a toolkit passed down as naturally as language. Each child learned not only how to make tools or gather food, but why those skills mattered. Survival became tradition, and tradition became identity. The tools they carried were not just instruments of survival, but symbols of their resilience. Beyond survival skills, legacy was written in ritual. The ceremonies, songs, and offerings of the tribe became traditions that carried meaning across seasons. Each ritual tied the tribe to its past, reminding them of their ancestors' struggles and triumphs. These traditions shaped their view of life, a belief that survival was a sacred duty, and every action was part of a greater cycle. The rituals themselves became part of what was passed on, ensuring that the spirit of the tribe endured as surely as its survival. Legacy also lived in the relationships they nurtured. Bonds between hunters and gatherers, between elders and children, between tribes and their allies, became part of a social inheritance. These connections taught trust, cooperation, and respect, lessons as vital as fire or food. In their unity lay strength, and in their strength lay the ability to endure the harshest winters. This understanding of interconnectedness became a foundation of human culture. The legacy of the Ice Age was also a legacy of adaptation. Cavemen learned to read the signs of the land, to listen to the whispers of the wind, to respect the cycles of life and death. They adapted their hunting methods, their shelters, their rituals to match the changing world. This adaptability became part of who they were, a legacy of resilience written in bones and footprints across frozen landscapes. They learned that survival was not static, but an evolving art shaped by every winter and every choice. Even death became part of their legacy. The way they honored the fallen, with offerings, with stories, with memory, became part of the tribe's heritage. Graves carved in stone or snow became markers of respect, teaching the living to carry forward the lessons of those who came before. In remembering their dead, they preserved not only history, but identity. Legacy was the promise that they would endure, that their people would carry their story forward. As the ice aged and generations passed, the legacy of these cavemen stretched beyond their own survival. It became the foundation of human endurance, the first chapters of culture and civilization. Their lives, written in the language of snow, fire, and story, became the roots of a greater human journey. The legacy in the ice was not a single moment, but a thread woven through time. The first proof that humanity could endure, adapt, and pass its flame onward. In the end, the cavemen of the Ice Age left more than survival behind. They left a blueprint of cooperation, resilience, respect, and memory. That legacy became part of the human story, carried forward through millennia. And in every generation that learned to walk together, share warmth, and honor life, the legacy of those who endured the coldest winters lived on. The end of winter was never simply the end of cold. It was a beginning. For the cavemen, surviving the harshest seasons was a constant rebirth. Each spring brought renewal, not only of the land, but of life itself. The thaw-released rivers revealed hidden food and opened paths that had been closed by frost. For the tribe, the passing of winter was a triumph, proof of endurance, proof that they could survive the world's harshest trials. It was both a relief and a celebration, marking a step toward a future shaped by survival and wisdom. The thaw transformed the landscape. Snow melted into streams that ran silver through valleys. Plants, long buried, began to breathe again. Animals moved toward new pastures, and the air was filled with the scent of change. For the cavemen, this was a time to prepare, to gather before the warmth faded again. They moved with renewed energy, tending to shelters, repairing tools, and sharing stories by firelight. The end of winter was a gift they honored, a reward for their endurance and the careful stewardship that had brought them through. Spring was a season of growth for the tribe itself. Legacy also lived in the relationships they nurtured. Bonds between hunters and gatherers, between elders and children, between tribes and their allies, became part of social inheritance. These connections taught trust, cooperation, and respect, lessons as vital as fire or food. In their unity lay strength, and in their strength lay the ability to endure the harshest winters. This understanding of interconnectedness became a foundation of human culture. The legacy of the Ice Age was also a legacy of adaptation. Cavemen learned to read the signs of the land, to listen to the whispers of the wind, to respect the cycles of life and death. They adapted their hunting methods, their shelters, their rituals to match the changing world. This adaptability became part of who they were, a legacy of resilience written in bones and footprints across frozen landscapes. They learned that survival was not static, but an evolving art shaped by every winter and every choice. Even death became part of their legacy. The way they honored the fallen, with offerings, with stories, with memory, became part of the tribe's heritage. Graves carved in stone or snow became markers of respect, teaching the living to carry forward the lessons of those who came before. In remembering their dead, they preserved not only history, but identity. Legacy was the promise that they would endure, that their people would carry their story forward. As the ice aged and generations passed, the legacy of these cavemen stretched beyond their own survival. It became the foundation of human endurance, the first chapters of culture and civilization. Their lives, written in the language of snow, fire, and story, became the roots of a greater human journey. The legacy in the ice was not a single moment, but a thread woven through time, the first proof that humanity could endure, adapt, and pass its flame onward. In the end, the cavemen of the Ice Age left more than survival behind. They left a blueprint of cooperation, resilience, respect, and memory. That legacy became part of the human story, carried forward through millennia. And in every generation that learned to walk together, share warmth, and honor life, the legacy of those who endured the coldest winters lived on. Children grew stronger in warmth, learning more each day of the language, tools, and rituals of survival. Elders shared wisdom more freely, knowing their lessons were rooted in years of hardship. Hunters and gatherers planned for the seasons ahead, building stores for the next winter, weaving their survival into a cycle that stretched beyond themselves. In those months of renewal, the tribe strengthened, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. The passage of seasons became a rhythm, and they became attuned to its pulse. The dawn of a new age was marked by change in more than weather. The lessons of survival began to grow into vision. They learned to create tools that endured longer, shelters that could withstand harsher storms, and strategies that expanded their reach. Journeys became more ambitious, exploring new lands and testing new ways to live. They were no longer simply surviving the winter. They were learning to master life within it. The tribe evolved, carrying with them the seeds of culture, technology, and connection that would define humanity for millennia. Spring also brought deeper connection to the land. The cavemen understood that survival was not just about taking what they needed, but sustaining what they depended upon. They tended to sacred spaces, marked by stone or bone, where rituals of renewal took place. Offerings were made to the spirits of the land, thanks given for life preserved. These acts became a living tradition, reinforcing the bond between the people and the world that sustained them. Through gratitude, they forged a deeper respect for the cycles of nature. The tribe's celebrations of a new season were quiet yet profound. Around fires and shelters and in open clearings, they gathered to honor survival and renewal. Feasts were shared, songs were sung, and dances marked the joy of life returned. These moments were more than relief, they were affirmation. They reaffirmed their strength, their unity, and their ability to endure. Every celebration became a promise to themselves that no matter how fierce the winter, they would survive and stand together to greet the dawn. The dawn of a new age was also a moment of transformation for the tribe's identity. They began to see themselves not only as survivors of winter, but as builders of culture. Their traditions, tools, and stories became part of something larger, a shared heritage that connected them to ancestors and descendants. They became aware that each winter survived was part of a greater journey. This awareness shaped how they lived, how they taught, and how they prepared for what lay ahead. In that fragile light of early spring, the cavemen saw the future. They knew that the lessons learned in ice and shadow would define generations to come. They carried forward the knowledge of fire, of shelter, of unity, of respect for the wild. And with that knowledge, they stepped into a new age, one not only of survival, but of growth, connection, and possibility. The winters they endured had forged them, and the springs they welcomed gave them a legacy. In the dawn of a new age, humanity began to dream beyond survival, toward civilization.